Okay, this is the penultimate episode of Historians in Cars Getting Coffee. We're not quite on the way to the airport yet. We're gonna stop and have a coffee stop. But before we do that, we're just going to sort of do a last in-car chat. And what we really wanted to talk about, well, do you want to introduce, Warren, what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so one of the papers we haven't had a chance to talk about yet during the conference was a fantastic paper given by Professor Stephen Fritz about the German perspective of D-Day. And there are lots of interesting things. He had loads of really fascinating questions from the audience, a lot of what-if questions. And some of the points that he brought up was exactly how did D-Day look for the Germans going in? You know, there's this myth that like Hitler slept and, you know, they just sort of fumbled this thing. But in fact, it was a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, and so I suppose one of my big takeaways from the paper was the fact that although in reality the Germans were kind of doomed from the perspective of the material resources that the Allies were able to put into D-Day, in fact there were ways in which, from their perspective, it could look rational to think that even though by this stage in the war they weren't going to achieve all the conquests and the victory that they wanted, that they might be able to they thought that in 1943 there was a possibility of fighting the Soviets to a standstill in the east. They thought they had a potential route to keeping the Allies off the beaches in France. Of course, they didn't know exactly where the Allies were going to land, but they had some clue it might actually be in Normandy. And so, from their perspective, they perhaps look slightly less irrational than the sort of typical picture might portray them as in terms of their military strategy.
No, that's right. Now, a couple things, just hearing you say that sparked my imagination, that when Professor Fritz was saying that, one, he pointed out that the Soviets and the Nazis had sort of continually been meeting around peace talks in Sweden. So that was going on. So they thought they could play Russia to a standstill or a stalemate at least. And then on the western side of it, there was this issue around, well, they have, I've forgotten the number of panzer divisions, but it was an enormous number of panzer divisions. And then there was the fact that it was split between two field marshals, Rommel and Rundstedt. And Hitler was unable to pick which one they wanted to control. Now, a lot of the questions were like, well, what kind of difference would Erwin Rommel make if he was in charge? Would the defense be better? Yeah. And ultimately, it wouldn't have mattered whose strategy they used because it was such an overwhelming force. But from the Nazi perspective, prior to D-Day, you've got to remember, every amphibious assault has gone really badly.
Yes, very true.
For the Allied powers, in Italy and Jep and everywhere else. Yep. And so, there's a huge sort of reason why I think that, Hitler didn't really take it seriously, or at least felt that it was going to be sort of a sideshow to the main thing.
Well, he thought, didn't he, really, that it was possible to, in the immediate sort of June the 6th, he thought, well, we may be able to actually sort of keep them off, and that this is kind of like the decisive moment. And of course, in some ways, it obviously was extremely challenging. It was no cakewalk when the Allies did land. So I suppose it was also clear that Rommel fairly soon afterwards, I forget the exact date, but sort of a few weeks after D-Day, he actually does say to Hitler, well, look, I think you should kind of sue for peace or end the war somehow. Hitler isn't having any of it. Of course, I think that by that stage, actually that really wasn't an option for him. That by that stage, the Allies, who had been sort of open about the fact they were demanding unconditional surrender since the Casablanca conference, really, probably from their own political point of view, couldn't have made a peace, even if they wouldn't have wanted to, but sort of it wasn't really politically possible for them at that point. So in a sense, Hitler is kind of totally doomed from that point. And I suppose the interesting part of it is not really would the outcome have been different, but how do we explain people's actions and beliefs at the time?
Right, yeah, that's exactly, it's, like we've talked about, that's been a recurring theme in the conference and in our talks, is that a lot of historians have this sort of retroactive look. Well, it's like, oh, well, this is an obvious decision. Well, at the time, it may not be such an obvious decision. And one of the questions that this kind of stuff brings up, I thought was a good segue, Richard, that you mentioned about sort of total unconditional surrender. One of the questions Stephen Fritz got, and I've been thinking a lot about, is, well, let's imagine that the German strategy had been totally successful because there was really no plan B for the Allies, and they were able to knock out America. What would happen then? Yeah. Would they have then been able to beat Russia? Is there a world at which, Germany's successful here? Well, and the answer is, since the Casablanca Conference, and actually before then, the answer is no. And the reason is because, of course, they were building the bomb here. I mean, we were just in Oak Ridge yesterday, and it was always originally intended to be dropped on Germany. So there's no outcome in this where the atomic weapon isn't used, particularly if Germany's still in the war.
Yes, exactly. So if somehow, they had managed to fend off the Allies in Normandy and has prolonged the war for another year or something, then ultimately it was quite probable that the bomb would have been dropped on Berlin, and then of course that leads to a sort of, well, in one sense the outcome is exactly the same, and yet, of course, with the bomb then not being used for the first time in Japan, perhaps the Japanese would have been inclined to surrender, but that might have been a surrender which was, falling short of actually total military defeat and occupation from their point of view.
Right. So I mean, and as historians, we're always loath to play what-if games.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, Richard likes to, but he's he's the revisionist. So what are you going to do? But I mean, the point is that there's a lot of this, like, there's this idea that maybe somehow Germany could have been successful, and really, since the Casablanca Conference, I don't think that outcome's ever possible. Particularly when you look at just the material, weight of the British Empire. I mean, this gets into a deeper historiographical discussion about the People's War and so forth. But if you just look at men and material by the numbers, what was the name of the author of that book, Richard?
Which book? David Aitchison.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. He basically makes the point that Britain's never really alone. He's got the empire, he's got the Commonwealth, and that alone, by sheer material, means that it can defeat Germany. And so, I don't think there's ever really an outcome once total war had happened where Germany kind of comes out of it.
So I think that's a good point to end on. We can speculate about what would have happened if the Germans had had more coffee, but it probably still wouldn't have been good, whatever it was.
Probably not. Weren't they on methamphetamines at one point?
Well, yeah, maybe actually coffee would have been a better option.